He's a businessman. He's been running his business in a few unethical ways, and now he's running the most powerful country in the world. So do you really think that he's going to be focusing on global policies that don't actually benefit him?
Officially, he has distanced himself from his companies. We see that in reality, he has not, because he nominated other members of his family to run the companies.
I think that other parts of the world will start advancing faster. I think that talent will flow less into the United States and will shift more into Europe and Asia.
He's pretending to deliver on his promises through what I would call also the entertainment presidency, but he is not delivering what the people asked for.
Well, welcome to everyone to the first plenary session today. It's on 100 days of President Trump. As someone who was on the Clinton campaign, that's still hard to get across my lips, President Trump. And we were just hearing about nostalgia for yesterday's meeting of the conference. Some of us have nostalgia for some other times indeed. But I'm a lucky guy. After that horrible night of November 8th, I was back here working at the University of St.Gallen, which is, as you know, a great place to work. And today I have the great fortune of moderating what I think is going to be a fantastic session and an excellent discussion. Let me briefly introduce our panelists. And Symone, I think you won't hold it against me if we go ladies first. Symone Sanders is the former National Press Secretary for Senator Bernie Sanders, no relation. She's a distinguished political commentator and leader of tomorrow, which I think is kind of the wrong way to talk about her. I think she's a leader of today. But Symone's lively presentations challenge the conventional wisdom that strong communities are really defined by what they have in common. Symone takes a different position and says differences can actually contribute to effective social movements. Evgeny Morozov is an author, columnist, and blogger. Originally from Belarus, Evgeny has thought hard about the political and social implications of technology and has been quite skeptical about the popular view that the internet is something that sort of has an inherent democratic logic and will inevitably lead to the democratization of authoritarian regimes. In fact, he's been a strong critic of what he calls the internet freedom agenda of the American government, which in the end he thinks is naive and counterproductive. Last but not least, to my far left is Tony Schwartz. He's the CEO of the Energy Project, which is not about oil, gas, or renewables, which is something we talk about a lot here at this university, but rather how to power your life. On his website, one can read, "We build energy and resilience across 4 dimensions: physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual, to deliver sustained high performance and improved employee engagement." Tony is also a former journalist and, what I think is quite interesting for us today, the ghost author of The Art of the Deal, the book that brought Donald Trump to the attention of a wider, nationwide, in fact, international audience. Will you please join me in welcoming my panelists? Now, just a few words about what we're going to try to do. The focus of this panel is not going to be on Trump bashing. I think that's something any of us could do, and it's actually quite boring at this point. Rather, what I want to do is use this really interesting panel and these excellent panelists to analyze and try to answer 3 simple but also somehow complex interrelated questions. First, where are we today? Or where is the U.S. at the outset of what seems to be an unorthodox administration? Second, how did we get here? What were the historical antecedents and the contemporary political and social conditions that allowed for a candidate Trump to emerge and eventually become elected? And finally, perhaps even most importantly, where are we going? What will the United States and the world look like at the end of the first 4 years of this president? Each of the panelists brings a very particular prism through which to try and answer, or to view and try and answer these questions. Evgeny, I know you have been researching the origins and the development of the contemporary conservative movement in the United States and have some thoughts on how Trump's emergence may actually fit into some larger trends. Symone, you better than anyone on this panel understand what's on the mind of a changing American electorate, an angry American electorate, which is no longer dominated by white men of European origin, in spite of all the talk about angry white males. I'm hoping you'll be able to help us understand the current contemporary social and political context within which Trump emerges and is trying to govern. And Tony, you better than anyone other than members of the Trump family, I guess, understand how Trump thinks. And yes, he does think. So I'm very much interested in hearing your thoughts on how Trump is likely to react to the demands of the job and the very polarized and poisoned political environment, which seems to be both a cause and consequence of his election. So why don't we start off with each of you giving us your general thoughts on Trump, his origins in this interesting political context, and where we might be going. And then we'll move to some more specific questions and perhaps an interesting debate. And I'll ask you to speak in the order your names appear in the program. So Evgeny, the floor is yours.
Sure. Well, I think the main analytical challenge in trying to understand Donald Trump and his rise is not to treat him as an exceptional president that has come out of the blue, has come out of nowhere, while at the same time recognizing that the coalition that he managed to put together to get elected and now to govern is in many senses a very exceptional coalition. And that parts of that coalition will probably get amplified, both in terms of their political power and their rhetorical power and their financial power, in ways that are unprecedented. Right? And I think that the conventional parts of that coalition, we can more or less leave aside. We understand them. It's his roots in the real estate sector, his connections to the Wall Street guys, his connection to leveraged buyout industry, and so forth. All of that, I think, is more or less well understood. What I think is not as well understood are his connections to different parts of the conservative movement, so to say, and to the new, I would say, conservative counterculture that has very interesting links to the digital culture in Silicon Valley. And I must say that that was also my original entry point into the subject. I mean, for reasons of my own personal sanity, I tend to stay away from studying or commenting on US politics. And yet I was drawn into that debate as I watched quite a few very influential people in Silicon Valley and a lot of communities in Silicon Valley. Before the election, not after the election. Before the election, they were already expressing quite a lot of support for Donald Trump. Right? And it was not just people like Peter Thiel, who are the kind of obvious public visible layer of this group, but also quite a few lesser-known entrepreneurs, venture capitalists, innovators, and so forth. And as I started studying what they were writing and what they were saying, I understood that they actually had quite of an intellectual argument as to why they think electing Donald Trump is a good idea. And many of their arguments, in turn, came out, I would argue, from two parts of the conservative movement in the US that have more or less been suppressed. And they've been suppressed both by the mainstream kind of neoconservative elite in America, and they have been suppressed by the bloc that represents the financial sector. And those two groups you can split into the cultural bloc that cares mostly about cultural war and immigration and things connected to race, and then the extreme libertarian bloc that cares about foreign policy because they want a very non-interventionist foreign policy, and they care more or less about not just shrinking the government, but eliminating it altogether and replacing it with private players that can provide private arbitrage, private security, private healthcare, private everything, more or less. And those two wings of the conservative movement have traditionally been suppressed during the Cold War, and they kind of clung together to the parts of the conservative movement that were led by people like Bill Buckley. right? What has happened is that after the end of the Cold War, that coalition fell apart. And now we suddenly see an effort by those people, and that effort has a much longer running pedigree. It did not start with Trump. You could make a very good case that somebody like Pat Buchanan in 1990s already represented the candidate of that group. You can actually see it in the people who advised him. You actually had extreme libertarians like Murray Rothbard join forces with extreme cultural conservatives, paleoconservatives like Paul Gottfried, Samuel Francis, and others. And I would argue that to understand many of the people we are dealing with now, people like the alt-right leader Richard Spencer, for example, you actually have to go back and study the formation of that coalition, right? I would just like to caution you against thinking that this is something new, that the alt-right somehow has happened in 2015 or 2016. I would also like to caution you against thinking that somehow they will be marginalized and suppressed as the more mainstream blocks of the Republican kind of coalition reestablish control over Trump. They will not be suppressed for one single reason. The only way for Trump to keep winning, so to say, to use his language, with the general public is to be constantly attacking the media. Right? And that's more or less how he builds support for his policies. He establishes himself vis-a-vis this ruling coastal elite, right, represented in the media. And he needs this kind of alternative coalition, of which Steve Bannon probably is the most visible public face, in order to keep making and waging those attacks. And that also more or less makes him completely invulnerable to any further attacks in the media. Because the more that he attacks the media, which was also, by the way, the strategy of many of these factions, more extreme factions within his coalition for 20 or 30 years. And you know, that's a strategy that also got amplified quite a lot by the alliance with Silicon Valley, who have their own alternative forms of disseminating messages, who have their own alternative forms of more or less establishing their own cultural hegemony and cultural consensus. I would argue that he's not just going to get rid of Bannon, he's not going to get rid of that base, because ultimately that base allows him to continue building his case against the media. So I'd probably stop here, and more than happy to continue afterwards in Q&A.
That was a great seminar. Symone, we had some historical antecedents here discussed from Evgeny. You were sort of on the ground experiencing the feelings of what I found to be a very mobilized electorate. And I wonder if you could sort of try to put the emergence of Trump into that context. You were intimately associated with the other insurgent candidate, Bernie Sanders, and I think really better than anyone around here, you could really give us some insight into where is the American electorate and how did this happen?
Definitely. So people are still wondering, more than 100 days later, how did this happen? Thank you for having me here today. So during I would say the rise of Donald Trump was contributed to a number of different factors. But you cannot understand how we got here, how Donald Trump became the 45th president of the United States, if you don't understand that in 2016, we were having a change election. It wasn't very clear that it was a change election to a lot of people in the beginning, but I would say, you know, halfway through the primary season, definitely once we got to the general, it was very clear this was a change election. Under President Obama, the United States had 75 straight months of private sector job growth. That's unprecedented. Really great things were happening. Our economy was in the ditch more than 8 years ago. President Obama literally pulled our economy out of that proverbial ditch. But also, during this time, over the last 50 years, the gap between the wealthiest people in America and the poorest people in America has grown, and it is now the largest it has ever been. So that means, yes, we've had 75 straight months of private sector job growth, but there are so many people living in America for whom they work 40, 50, 60 hours a week. They work 2-3 jobs, and they still cannot make enough money to put food on their table to feed their families. That's an issue. So there are there's a couple realities, but we were dealing with two real realities. And so when you come to 2016, you have a candidate such as Bernie Sanders, who is talking about, who is in fact a populist, and I would argue so is Donald Trump. In my view, populism is one of these thin ideologies that has to be mixed with a thicker ideology. So Bernie Sanders was an economic populist. I would argue Donald Trump's populism was mixed with a little bit of economics, a little bit of racism, a little bit of ethnocentrism, some nationalism, all called up in there to create what we have today. So you had these candidates who were speaking directly to the reality of millions of people in America. You're working 40, 50, 60 hours a week. You can't make enough money to put food on the table to feed your families. You have not seen growth. That's a real reality for millions and millions of people. So I think what Donald Trump was able to master is he spoke to that segment of people in the United States of America who that was real for them. They did not feel that after 8 years of hope and change, after a two-term Obama presidency, that their life had moved. In addition to, I'm a CNN political commentator now, but I'm also a communications consultant, and I work with a group called Priorities USA. Formerly, I'm the Super PAC, but now they do a lot of polling and research, and we're really a service center for the left. Something that we did post-election was we did focus groups. From the end of January to mid-February of Obama-Trump voters and base turnout voters for the Democrats that did not turn out in 2016. Those base turnout voters were overwhelmingly young people of color, Latinos, African Americans. And in these focus groups, these Obama-Trump voters, people that voted for Obama in 08 and 12, but then switched their vote to Donald Trump in 2016, they all said they voted for Donald Trump for change. Every single person. They said they voted for Obama 8 years ago for change. And I will never forget a gentleman. We were in Milwaukee, Wisconsin in one of these focus groups. And excuse my language, but he said, you know, 8 years ago, I lived in a shithole, and I live in a shithole now. Literally. So, my life was no different after 8 years of Obama, so I thought I could just give Donald Trump a chance. For this rising American electorate, people who are overwhelmingly young people, millennials like myself, I'm 27, young people who increasingly identify as independent, who do not have any real party loyalty, really. They like to vote on the issues. They felt that the Democratic Party and the Democratic candidate, Hillary Clinton, did not speak directly to their reality. They heard that Donald Trump was so bad, but they didn't know what Hillary Clinton stood for. And so when it was time to vote, they were not motivated at the polls. These young people, this rising American electorate, these drop-off voters for the Democrats, they said they cared about the economy, but they also cared about entrepreneurship. They cared about these social issues. They cared about plans for reducing college debt, or everything on down the line, and they felt like they did not get that from their candidates, but they also thought that there was never in any way in the world that Donald Trump could win. So we didn't like Hillary, but we're also not going to vote for her because she's got it in the bag. So I think you have to understand that this was a change election, and there were so many people who pulled the lever for Donald Trump in spite of his sexism, in spite of his racism, because they felt he would literally be better for them economically, he would better their lives. Now make no mistake, there were literally people that pulled the lever for Donald Trump because they did not want immigrants coming into the country. There are people that pulled the lever for Donald Trump because they thought after 8 years of the first black president, anybody could be better, especially better than the woman who's perpetuating that she's going to continue the legacy of President Obama. So, in my opinion, we cannot talk about the rise of Donald Trump without talking about the backlash to the first African-American president of the United States of America, and absolutely without realizing that the reality for so many people in America is not a really great one, young people included. And there were folks who decidedly stayed home because they either felt their vote didn't matter, they were turned off by the election, and then there were folks that literally went out and pulled the lever because their lives had not changed and they had not moved, and they thought this unconventional character, this unconventional guy, who, you know, sounds a little like Bernie Sanders, not a lot, very minimal, could potentially do something to better their lives. Now, I think, in wrapping up these comments, I think it is a very scary place to be when people are starting to compartmentalize their politics and pull the lever in spite of so many other things because they really didn't believe he would do or say or follow through on any of the things he said during the campaign trail. So that's how we got here. Change election.
Thank you. Tony, so, we've got this kind of conservative coalition that fell apart after the Cold War and was waiting for somebody to put it together. We've got an electorate that's angry and wants change. How did it become this guy, Donald Trump? What is it about Donald Trump that makes him the person that can sense this opportunity, take advantage of it, and emerge victorious in November?
Well, first of all, I think Symone is absolutely right that it wasn't Trump so much as it was change. And so Trump is an accident of history, even though I agree with Evgeny that he comes from, there was a tradition that preceded him by many, many years that we've probably underestimated. But I feel as if the best contribution I can make to this panel is to say something about Trump, the man, who Trump is, in this context, in an incredibly demanding, high-paced, and above all, complex world. The most important quality for a great leader is to be a great human being, first. And that sounds obvious, but it hasn't been considered all that important. And Donald Trump is not a great human being. Donald Trump is missing 4 key qualities that any great human being would have to have. The first and most obvious one is knowledge. I didn't mean it to be funny. It's terrifying. He is one of the most spectacularly ignorant human beings I've ever met. Sorry, but I'm gonna have to bleed into Trump bashing, which I will consider to be factual as opposed to opinion. But he has an inability to pay attention. He probably has ADHD. He probably has a severe case of it. But in any case, if you can't pay attention for very long, you can't absorb information, and therefore he lacks knowledge. That's number one. Number two, he lacks a conscience, a soul, beliefs, values. I in the campaign where I was very, very vocal, described him as a sociopath. And I believe he is. And a sociopath is someone who is not only extremely self-absorbed, but is also incapable of distinguishing between right and wrong and not moved by it. Third thing he's missing is empathy. He has an inability to connect with other human beings because he's so exclusively preoccupied with himself. He, I think, does not have close or intimate relationships with anyone. And I mean anyone. He has some sort of strange relationship with his daughter, but it feels to me as if he's somewhat contemptuous of his 2 sons and uninterested in his wife. And he's made it very clear that he doesn't have friends. And the final thing he's lacking is self-awareness. So he doesn't know any of this. So the Donald Trump that we see is not, you suggested that he was that he did think, and I think the vast majority of the time he doesn't think. He is run by his emotions. He's impulsive. He feels things, and he thinks that the things he feels are thoughts. But they're not. That's number one. Number two, Donald Trump is a classic case of arrested development. Development is about seeing more and including less. If you have a fire in your house and you're at work and you have 2 kids at home, one 10 and one 5, you want the 10-year-old to handle that fire rather than the 5-year-old, because the 10-year-old sees more. And you want the 15-year-old, if you have that person in your household, to be handling it rather than the 10-year-old. Why? Because he sees more or she sees more. Donald Trump's development, I think, fundamentally ended at the age of about 7. And psychological development. He's slightly older mentally. And it happened, I believe, because he had a brutal father and an overwhelmed mother. And he grew up in a world, and you have to understand this because we have 3 prevailing worldviews in my mind that are competing with one another right now: pre-conventional, pre-modern or pre-conventional, modern, and postmodern. But Donald Trump has a tribal worldview, one that there's not a high percentage of people in the world who have that perspective, and certainly not in the West, and God save us, not among leaders of the free world. But what happened to Donald Trump is that he grew up with this vision, this worldview: kill or be killed, win or lose, 100% binary. So therefore, it's either him or it's you in any contest, in any decision. And so given that, he operates the way you would expect a person who believes his survival and his self-esteem is constantly at stake, which is he stokes it, and he pays a lot of attention to it.
Can I just push you on one part here, or expand on it a bit? When somebody like me watches Trump and hears him repeat over and over with some sense of conviction blatant falsehoods, I ask myself, is this part of the shtick or part of the strategy, the marketing strategy that's got him where he is, or does he really believe it? And from what you're telling me now, he's not a liar, but he's delusional.
I think that's probably closer to it.
And if that's true, what does that mean?
Well,
I'd almost rather have the liar, because you understand where the liar's coming from.
Well, then I can give you some reassurance. Yes, he is a liar. No, listen, when I wrote The Art of the Deal in 1987, 30 years ago, and please know that though Donald Trump said in his campaign announcement, the world needs the person who wrote The Art of the Deal as president, I didn't believe that I should be president. But it was disturbing to me that he thought he wrote the book, because actually I wrote it, he read it once, and that was the relationship. But in the course of researching that book, meaning going to other people who were part of the deals that I was writing about in that book, I would over and over hear that the things he'd told me were contradicted by the people who he sent me to talk to about the deals. And this was disturbing, even though I was just a gun for hire. It was still disturbing. I came out of a long background as a journalist, and the idea that I was going to write things that weren't true was painful. Probably not painful enough at the time. And what I came up with was a phrase that he fell in love with to cover all sins, which was truthful hyperbole, which of course is a contradiction in terms. It's nonsense. There's, if it's hyperbole, it's not true, so it's not truthful. But truthful hyperbole is, I think, what he thinks he's doing when he is saying lies. He actually doesn't believe that they're false. I think he probably still believes that Obama wasn't born in the United States in some part of him. But he will exaggerate and yes, for manipulative reasons, choose to say something that he's well aware is not true. He has now done it so much that it's more uncomfortable for him to go to what he wishes were true than it is to go to what's true.
Symone, Tony said that for Donald Trump, it's tribal. Let me just quote for a minute a few things you said about Donald Trump during the campaign, and then explore this a bit. You said, I don't know Donald Trump personally, but I'm convinced he doesn't really care about black or brown people or earning our votes. Basically, Donald Trump is refusing to talk to black and brown voters in the media and in our own communities. Donald Trump seems to be unaware that racism does not exist in a vacuum, rather it is supported through institutions and people like him. Now, a lot of people, and you made this point as well, that to really understand Trump's election, you need to understand economic fundamentals in America. And then we bring in the question of race, and you said, well, he doesn't understand the question of race. I'm wondering whether that's too kind. Does he maybe understand race all too well, understand that it is tribal today in the United States, and he uses the issue of race in some subtle and some not so subtle ways to mobilize precisely those parts of the electorate that had some roots in the kinds of intellectual developments that Evgeny was talking about?
So one, I'd like to note, in my opinion, alt-right is nothing but white supremacy dressed up in khakis. The alt-right is in fact white supremacy. When you were talking about the alt-right, you were talking about white supremacists. You were talking about people who believe black people, women, people of Jewish heritage background are less than. So I would like to make that perfectly clear. So I do not think of the alt-right as some highly intellectual movement. I think of it as modern day white supremacy, okay? So let me just be clear. So because the alt-right is modern day white supremacy, I believe that I still do not think Donald Trump understands the nuances and the complexity of race, especially in the context of American politics. I do think he understands how race and playing off race can play to his advantage. And so that is why you saw Donald Trump during the campaign say things like, black people, what do you have to lose? Vote for me. Well, everything to lose, voting for you. That's why you saw him, every time he refers to people of color, particularly African Americans, he talks about places like Chicago, as if all of the black people in America only live in Chicago. Newsflash, I'm from Nebraska. And there are black people all over the country and all over the world, mind you. And so I really believe that he does not understand the nuances, but he understands how it plays to his advantage. We have to go back. Donald Trump rose to prominence not just through the art of the deal, but by perpetuating the racist birther conspiracy. He literally fueled this deep conservative movement that othered the first African-American president of the United States and said he was not from here. He is not of us. And he went on television time after time after time. He literally was the leader of this birther conspiracy because he knew it played to his advantage. Not because I don't actually think that he believes President Obama wasn't born in America. But I do think he believes that there are millions of people out there that do.
You know, just to build on what you said, Symone, in addition to that, we know that he came from a background, his father, Fred, was virulently racist, and was very explicit about keeping black people out of his developments.
Oh yes, there's cases
Correct.
where his company was sued.
Correct. The government came after him and found in that he was being racist, and Donald, then a rising member of that real estate family, defended him, hired Roy Cohn to do that defense. And I do believe, and this is...
For those who don't know Roy Cohn, he was the lawyer of one of our worst senators in history, MacArthur.
Joe McCarthy.
McCarthy in the McCarthy era, so
yes.
a scurrilous fellow.
Right. And who, by the way, when he was gay, but in the closet, and when he got AIDS, Trump abandoned him. And I went to see Roy Cohn in the last months of his life at Trump's behest, for information. And all Roy Cohn could talk about was how betrayed he felt by Trump. So
hard to feel sorry for him, though.
There you got it. But the thing is that my experience of Trump is that, Symone, he loved one small group of black people who were boxers or football players. That's who he thought good black people do one of those two things. And so implicit.
Damn shame, excuse me, but absolutely ridiculous. That's true. And so I think that plays into, no, I mean, it's true that he thinks that. So I think that plays into, we just have to be frank, and I'm always very candid about this, sometimes to people's not delight on television, and saying that we have yet to really reckon with race in America. Like the history that race has played, how race and racism is institutionalized in many of our institutions, from our corporate community all the way down to our educational institutions, in our media, on down the line. And until we have candid conversations about race, we will not be able to move past it. And because we don't have, and we have not had a candid conversation about race, it's very, very hard to talk about Donald Trump. Look, I'm not one of those people that believe it's an either or. It's either we talk about the white working class voter or the working class, but that's really code for white working class voter, or we talk about social issues. Because they're absolutely intertwined. And the idea that black or brown people in America don't care about jobs, also don't care about the economy, is absolutely egregious. But the rhetoric of the last year and a half has been that over the last 40, 50 years, everybody has gotten ahead except white people. That is literally the code, except white men in America, which one could argue may be true. There are many. If you go to places like McDowell County, West Virginia, one of the poorest places in the United States of America, where there's literally nothing but mountains and no cell service, I've been there, and you talk to people, rural, white, working class people, they are telling you that they feel as though the government and lots of other people have left them behind. Absolutely. You go to Chicago, Illinois, Omaha, Nebraska, where I'm from, Clarksdale, Mississippi, and you talk to working class black and brown people, people of color, they will tell you this exact same thing. But somehow, the rhetoric of this campaign, Donald Trump was able to capitalize on the feelings of the unforgotten man and woman, code for white working class people in America, got him elected.
Evgeny has said, a quote from you, Evgeny, the big threat facing Western societies today is not so much the emergence of illiberal democracy abroad as the persistence of immature democracy at home. Is what we're talking about sort of the racism making it impossible to have a coalition between people who actually do have the same interests? Is this an example of what you meant by immature democracy?
Well, what I meant is that we have to understand that a lot of anxieties that ordinary people feel towards what they would define as elites, whether those elites are intellectual or cultural or media elites, not all of those anxieties are completely unreal or fake. I mean, there is a good case to be made that the media has in fact failed to report as thoroughly as it should have on the origins and the consequences of the financial crisis, for example. There is a good case to be made that even a lot of experts working in banks, working in governments, have failed to anticipate the consequences and have failed to actually foresee the crisis. So if you think that anybody who questions economic expertise at this point is a populist, then the Queen of England is a populist because she herself has questioned the ability of economists to actually foresee the crisis. And I think that a lot of those real concerns about expertise and the ways in which money corrupts expertise, they have more or less been suppressed in the mainstream debate in the US and in Western Europe. And when the situation is like this, it makes it very easy for movements around people like Donald Trump, who have a long-running hatred of these institutions because they think that those are the institutions that have excluded them, probably for good reason, from the debate. They have a strategy and a lot of talking points to basically present those institutions as A, being corrupt, and B, as defending financial and political interests of certain sectors of society and of the economy. And I think that a lot of people, when they hear this kind of rhetoric, they see that it actually resonates with their own experience. So when I talk about the immaturity right, of many of our own democracies, I mean that, we do have to have that honest conversation, because not all is well. Not all is well in how the media works. Not all is well with the way in which digital transition has more or less undermined its ability to focus on anything but eyeballs and clicks. I mean, those are real conversations. So the fake news crisis is not just a crisis engineered or manipulated by Russia, which has been 90% of all the debates about it. It's also a crisis of the collapse of many of the traditional institutions of journalism that now find themselves channeling more and more money, data, and audiences to just a few giant technology companies in Silicon Valley, many of whose workers and investors then happen to back Donald Trump. I mean, this is also a conversation that we should be having instead of just, finding convenient scapegoats elsewhere. Those scapegoats might be real and might exist, but it shouldn't exonerate us from having that conversation internally.
Let's open the conversation up to the audience because the time is passing quickly. I'd like to take maybe 2 questions, maybe 3 as a bundle, turn it over to the panel, and then we'll have to clear out for the next group. I see a gentleman here. If you could stand up and identify yourself.
Thank you. My name is Pandu from Indonesia. Could the panelists give us your take on Trump's Asia policy? Because it seems that his top foreign policy priorities is to defeat ISIS and now North Korea. And this is also reflected in his first international visit that is planned to go to Saudi and Israel. And also, the DFAT also mentioned that the pivot to Asia has been abandoned. So could you please give us your take? Would Trump have a coherent Asia policy? Thank you.
No.
Do we have any other questions right now? Back here in the back, and then I have a lady up front here.
My name is Vishwa. I'm from Singapore. Now that we have established the truth that it's not a lie that Trump is delusional, what do we do? The USA is known for its elaborate and working system of checks and balances. To what extent do the checks and balances that have been institutionalized over the years, to what extent can it rein in the excessive behavior of Trump as president? Secondly, what is it that the global community can do to act as a check? Because Trump is not just the president of a country, he is the president of a country that also plays the role of global policeman.
Thank you. And could we get the lady up here in the front?
Thank you. Michaela Trojanov from Switzerland. Do the panelists see any commonalities between the nationalist movement, Trump movement in the US, and similar movements in Europe? And if yes, what kind of commonalities, what kind of same traits, or are the elements that were spelled out by the panelists limited more to North America, to the US?
Thank you. I think those are 3 great questions. I'll just repeat them briefly for everyone. Asia policy, do we have a coherent Asia policy? Can we expect one? Second, we've got a delusional president. Will checks and balances work to kind of compensate for that? Do global institutions or global power constellations check that president? And third, in what respect is this an American phenomenon, or is this something that needs to be seen in comparative perspective? Symone, why don't we start with you again?
To the last question about if this is an American phenomenon, absolutely not. We have seen this rise of, and again I'll use the term populist movements, because Donald Trump is in fact a populist. His brand of populism is just, not my cup of tea. But you've seen this rise of populism all throughout the world. We've seen it in Brexit, where we saw it in the United States of America. We're looking at it right now in France. So I think this is a global phenomenon that we have to think about in a global context. And definitely there's some fear-mongering happening. Like immigration is a thing throughout the world. Economies, people, their economic security is a real concern for them wherever they live. So I think that's the lens through which we have to look at it. To the answer about our checks and balances, yes, there are still checks and balances. I think the courts and the judiciary is the last check on Trump, and we've seen that with halts to the president's travel ban. We've seen that with organizations like the ACLU, which just yesterday was threatened to sue the president through his executive order, all about the churches and things of that nature. But I do believe that Donald Trump's presidency has exposed just how much of our American political process when it comes to the president is actually codified in process, and then what is actually just protocol. And so because Donald Trump has done many things that are not protocol, people are asking, well, are these impeachable offenses? And no, it's just protocol. It's not actually codified in law as real process. And so I don't know how we change that, because we've just operated in this manner for so long. But that is something that I think the world is waking up to. And I think the role of the global community is to lead where they see fit to lead. You know, just the other day, Angela Merkel, she spoke out against the atrocities against LGBTQ individuals, whereas my president didn't say anything. So in situations such as those, when it comes to global markets, when it comes to the economy, when it comes to leading on global fronts and collaboration, I think there is an opportunity in the global community for individuals who were not previously players to become players in the world of Donald Trump. And to Asia policy, I don't think he has one.
Evgeny.
Sure. So again, on the Asia policy, as on any policy of Donald Trump, I think you have to understand that there will never be any coherence, in part because he changes his mind on a daily basis, depending on what kind of emotional feedback he gets from the people he talks to and meets. So of course, you can try to identify what are some of the policies within the administration and different departments, Commerce Department, Treasury Department, and so forth, but all of that gets invalidated the moment Donald Trump picks up the phone and speaks to somebody, right? So I think that by now is quite evident. In terms of checks and balances, I think that traditionally, historically, the main check and balance on the power of a Republican president has been the Democratic Party, right? The reason why I think a lot of people got disappointed in Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama partly is twofold. It's that the perception was that they were very close, too close perhaps, to Wall Street, and they were very close to the military-industrial complex, and they were very much waging wars abroad. The problem is that now, the opposition to Donald Trump's America First agenda is also mostly engineered by the banks, on the one hand, who would like to maintain the globalist order that they have built, and the military-industrial complex that would like to continue with military operations in the Middle East and elsewhere. And the problem is that the Democrats, especially those who rallied behind Clinton and Obama, they are actually cheering now on both the Wall Street and the Pentagon, and they actually celebrate both the defense of the global economic order celebrated by Wall Street and the military operations celebrated by Pentagon. So I think the ultimate long-term consequences of Donald Trump's rule might be actually a further weakening of the left and of the Democratic Party, in as much as you think that the Democratic Party represents the left. And finally, on the question about the ties between populists globally and the extremists globally and the US, I think here we also have to take a much longer historical perspective. A lot of those contacts actually start in 1970s, 1980s and continue for quite a long time between those specific two camps that I mentioned as part of the Trump coalition. Currently, you already see people from La Nouvelle Droite in France and Lega Nord coming to America and establishing contact with many of those groups in the 1980s and 1990s. Somebody like Richard Spencer, who of course we can discount as a white supremacist, who nonetheless has an intellectual dimension, who aspires to run a publishing house, aspires to run a think tank. I mean, he's not just your usual thug. This is how we think about white supremacists. He models himself quite deliberately on the French Nouvelle Droite and on Alain de Benoit. And they're pursuing a very sophisticated strategy of waging, I would say, countercultural hegemony by trying to engage in what the French New Right has been doing for 30 years, which is what they call meta-politics. And for them, meta-politics means politics that happens outside of the political party system, outside of the parliament. This is why for them it's so important to leverage new media, to leverage YouTube, to leverage any kind of resource that allows them to put their positions in circulation. It's a very Gramscian, actually leftist strategy. And they have read their texts and they have modeled themselves exactly on those. So again, I don't want to overemphasize the intellectual nature of Donald Trump, but that doesn't mean that the forces around him do not have a very learned, sophisticated strategy of how to establish hegemony over movements that have previously dominated the scene.
Tony, we've heard some sense that checks and balances work, caution from Evgeny that they might not, or not as strongly as we would like them to. How does Trump react when he's checked? That would be the question that would interest me.
So here are three outcomes over the next 3.5, 1,300 something days that I could imagine. The first, which Tim Snyder from Yale, who wrote On Tyranny, which is a book I recommend to every one of you. It's 50 pages long, and it reminds us of what to look out for in coming authoritarianism. But in any case, the first, he suggests, Snyder, and I agree, that at some point Trump will attempt to declare martial law. He will use some form of unrest or uprising to mobilize probably the military, who he reveres, and he will attempt to shut down the free press. And that is, of course, the first thing that any authoritarian does. And I have no doubt that Trump, in his dream, becomes, whether he uses the word or not, dictator as opposed to democratically elected president. If he fails, then he will either be impeached and or end up in prison. That's one outcome. How's that for starters? A similar outcome could occur in terms of failure if the Russian investigation ends up demonstrating a clear connection that's traceable to Trump. It reminds me so much of Nixon during Watergate. You're looking for the smoking gun, and it hasn't emerged yet, but there's every reason to believe it could. And if that happens, I could even imagine Republicans voting to impeach him. That's the second. The third is, the scariest, of course, is that he is a man ruled by emotion, not by thinking, and that he feels humiliated or dissed or diminished by Kim Jong-un or by Putin, and he holds the nuclear codes, and that's the end of us. All three of those are very, very real possibilities to me, and every reason for people to be extremely vigilant. What's the hope? Can I leave you on a hopeful note? I can, because I can hold apocalypse and optimism alongside one another, and I do think that, and Symone helped to lead a movement in this regard. I do think that this has galvanized a lot of people who, in a country that a smaller percentage of people vote for president than perhaps any developed country in the world. I think that we have a mobilization out of fear primarily that could lead to the kind of change that Hillary Clinton would have never gone for, and to a real reconsideration of the individualist, capitalist, market-driven forces that have dominated modernism to a more integrated kind of approach. One which values all of the key worldviews, pre-conventional, conventional, post-conventional, but in an integrative way, meaning we honor the best in each of the worldviews, whether or not they represent our fundamental worldview, and we are discerning about their worst, because in every worldview, There's the best aspects of it, there are best aspects of it, and there are terrible aspects of it. There are great representatives of it, and there are terrible representatives of it. So if we were to honor the best of what each of these worldviews bring to us, we would have potentially a very different world, a world that moved from me in the direction of we. And it made me think this morning when I was thinking about what I might add to this of a quote that probably a lot of you know, if I can find it, amid my notes. It's from Hillel, Rabbi Hillel, and it goes back, I think he said it, BC, and I can't find it, but I can remember it. If I am not from, can I? Let me see. I promise you that I'm going to get this in the next 2 seconds.
That's about what we have.
If I am not for myself, then who is? Boy, I'm messing it up. Here's the last 4 words of it. And this is enough. If not now, when? If not now, when?
And those were the last 4 words of my panel. Won't you please join me in thanking this panel?